Imagine this. It is the summer of 1845. Two magnificent British ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, heavy with coal and provisions for 3 full years, sail quietly northward past the last familiar shores of Greenland. On board are exactly 129 men, every one of them hand-picked, every one of them believing they are about to write their names into history. Their commander, Sir John Franklin, stands on the deck of the Erebus, telescope in hand, watching the ice floes drift by like slow white ghosts. No one on Earth, not even Franklin himself, could possibly imagine that within 4 short years, every single one of those 129 souls would be gone, vanished, swallowed forever by the merciless Arctic ice. Their ships would disappear for more than 160 years, and the world would spend the next century and a half searching for answers that were colder and darker than anyone dared to dream. Tonight, let us drift together into that frozen silence, slowly, gently, as if the ice itself is whispering the story to us while we fall asleep. The story really begins many years before that fateful sailing. For centuries, the British Empire had dreamed of the Northwest Passage, a mythical shortcut through the top of North America that would let their trading ships reach the riches of Asia without sailing all the way around the dangerous tip of South America. Many brave men had tried and failed. Some had died of scurvy, some had been crushed by ice, some had simply disappeared. But by the 1840s, the Royal Navy believed the time had finally come. Steam power had arrived, new ships could be strengthened with iron plating, new scientific instruments could measure everything, and Britain wanted one last grand triumph of exploration before the Victorian age moved on to other glories. So, in the spring of 1845, the Admiralty chose Sir John Franklin. He was 59 years old, a little plump, a little slow of speech, but respected throughout the Navy as a man who had already survived 2 previous Arctic expeditions. His first voyage in 1919 had been a nightmare. His men had eaten their boots and nearly starved, yet Franklin had brought most of them home alive. People called him the man who ate his boots. He wore that nickname with quiet pride. His second expedition in 1925 had been far more successful. Now, with his second wife, Lady Jane, cheering him on from London, Franklin accepted the command that would become his last.
The 2 ships chosen were already legends. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror had both survived terrifying voyages to the Antarctic with Sir James Clark Ross just a few years earlier. They were bomb vessels originally built to hurl mortars at enemy forts, which made their hulls incredibly strong. Shipwrights now added extra layers of oak and iron plating around their bows. Their decks were reinforced to hold the crushing weight of ice. Brand new steam locomotives, yes, actual railway engines, were cut down and installed below decks so the ships could push through ice at nearly 4 knots, even when there was no wind. Each ship carried a 12-day supply of coal for the engines and enough food, lime juice, and preserved meat to last 3 years. The officers' cabins were lined with mahogany. There were libraries of over 1,000 books, including novels, scientific volumes, and even copies of Punch magazine for amusement. The ships had central heating systems that piped warm air through the lower decks. They carried photographic equipment, magnetic instruments, and even a small organ so the men could sing hymns on Sundays. Nothing like this had ever been sent into the Arctic before. The newspapers called the expedition the best-equipped exploring party that ever left our shores. On the 19th of May, 1845, the ships left Greenhithe amid cheering crowds and the firing of salutes. Franklin's daughter Eleanor waved from the shore. Lady Jane stood very straight, hiding her tears. The ship stopped briefly at Stromness in the Orkney Islands to take on fresh water and sheep, then pushed on toward Greenland. On the 26th of July, 1845, two whaling ships, the Prince of Wales and the Enterprise, met the Erebus and Terror in Baffin Bay. The captains exchanged pleasantries. Franklin seemed in excellent spirits. The ships were last seen sailing westward into Lancaster Sound, their sails full, their steam engines puffing gently, disappearing behind a curtain of ice and mist. No European eye would ever see them again. For the first year, everything went exactly according to plan, or so the officers' careful records would later show. The expedition wintered on the small barren island of Beechey in 1845 to 1846. They built a little observatory, set up a magnetic station, and buried 3 of their men who died of natural causes, probably tuberculosis or pneumonia. The graves, marked with neat wooden headboards, would be discovered years later still standing upright in the frozen ground. In the spring of 1846, the ships broke free of the ice and continued west, threading their way through the narrow channels of the Canadian Arctic archipelago. They passed the huge, silent cliffs of Devon Island and entered the waters that would eventually be named after Franklin himself. But then the ice began to close in. By September 1846, both ships were trapped fast in the pack ice off the northwest coast of King William Island. They would never sail freely again. The winter of 1846 to 1847 was long and dark. The sun disappeared completely for months. Inside the ships, the men kept the stoves burning, read their books, played cards, and waited. Franklin wrote in his log that the ships were in perfect safety. He still believed that when summer came, they would break free and complete the passage. Spring arrived in 1847, but the ice did not loosen. Franklin sent out sledge parties to explore the surrounding land. On one of those journeys, a party of officers left a note in a cairn on King William Island, recording that the ships were beset and that Sir John Franklin was still in command. That note would become one of the most important clues ever found. Then, on the 11th of June, 1847, Sir John Franklin died. The exact cause remains unknown, perhaps a stroke, perhaps complications from the lead poisoning that was slowly affecting everyone on board. He was buried somewhere on the ice or on the nearby shore. The command passed to Captain Francis Crozier of the Terror, an experienced polar sailor who had served with Ross in both the Arctic and Antarctic. Crozier was a different kind of leader from Franklin, quieter, more cautious, deeply worried about the supplies. He knew the men were already showing early signs of scurvy and weakness. The summer of 1847 came and went, and still the ice held the ships prisoner. The second winter, 1848 to 1849, was far worse. The coal began to run low. The preserved meat, sealed in tin cans soldered with lead, was slowly poisoning the men with every meal. Their teeth loosened, their gums bled, their legs swelled. Yet they continued their scientific observations, kept the decks cleared of snow, and held Sunday services. The ship's libraries were read cover to cover. The little monkey, Jacko, probably died early. No one recorded it. By the spring of 1848, Crozier knew the ships could not be saved. The ice was thicker than anyone had ever seen. The food would not last another winter. On the 22nd of April, 1848, the order was given to abandon ship. The 105 men still alive, 24 had already died, dragged lifeboats and sledges loaded with tents, blankets, guns, and as much food as they could carry across the jagged ice toward the mainland. They were heading for the Back River, more than 200 miles away,
where they hoped to find fish and caribou. It was a desperate march. Many of the men were already too weak to pull the heavy sledges. They left behind thousands of books, scientific instruments, silver cutlery engraved with officers' initials, and even a mahogany writing desk. The trail they left behind would be discovered years later by search parties, a trail of abandoned boats, skeletons, and heartbreaking relics. One boat still contained 2 skeletons, one lying in the bow, the other curled in the stern, surrounded by silk handkerchiefs, scented soap, and a copy of the Vicar of Wakefield. Another sledge carried hundreds of pounds of chocolate, toothbrushes, and curtain rods, things no starving man would have carried unless his mind was already clouded by scurvy and lead.
Crozer and his remaining men reached the southern shore of King William Island. There, at a place the Inuit later called Starvation Cove, the last desperate struggle began. Some men tried to hunt seals, others simply lay down and never rose again. Evidence found in the 1980s and 1990s by forensic anthropologists showed cut marks on bones that could only have come from knives, clear signs that in the final weeks some of the men had turned to the last resort no explorer ever wants to admit. The Arctic had broken them completely. For years the outside world knew nothing. Lady Jane Franklin refused to believe her husband was dead. She spent her entire fortune, more than £35,000 of her own money, organizing search expeditions. She wrote letters to presidents, kings, and even the Tsar of Russia. She became one of the most famous women in Britain, a symbol of Victorian determination. In 1850 alone, more than a dozen ships were looking for Franklin. They found the 3 graves on Beechey Island, the note in the cairn, and scattered relics, but never the men. Then, in 1854, Dr. John Ray, a Scottish explorer working for the Hudson's Bay Company, met a group of Inuit near the mouth of the Back River. The Inuit told him they had seen white men dragging a boat across the ice 4 or 5 years earlier. They had found many bodies, some with guns, some with silver spoons. One old woman said she had seen 30 or 40 bodies in a tent, and signs that the men had eaten the dead. Ray bought some of the silverware from the Inuit, forks and spoons engraved with the crests of Franklin's officers. When he brought the news back to London, it caused a national scandal. People refused to believe English gentlemen could have resorted to cannibalism. Charles Dickens wrote furious articles defending the honor of the Navy. But Lady Jane quietly accepted the truth and continued her search for confirmation. Over the next decades, more searchers came. McClintock, in 1859, found the famous note in a cairn on King William Island that finally told the world Franklin had died in 1847 and that the ships had been abandoned in 1848. He also found a lifeboat with the 2 skeletons. Yet still, the ships themselves remained hidden beneath the ice. For 168 years, the Erebus and Terror lay silent on the seabed. Then, in 2014, a Canadian search team using sonar finally found the wreck of the Erebus in the shallow waters of Queen Maud Gulf, almost perfectly preserved, her masts still standing, her deck guns in place. 2 years later, in 2016, the Terror was discovered even farther south, upright on the bottom of Terror Bay, her name still clearly visible on the stern. The ships had drifted hundreds of miles south after the men had left them, carried by the ice until they finally sank. Today, divers have entered both wrecks. They have found plates still stacked in cupboards, bottles of wine, and even the captain's cabin on the Erebus with Franklin's own desk. The artifacts are now in museums in Canada, telling a story more astonishing than any fiction. Modern science has shown that the lead solder in the tin cans was slowly poisoning the crew from the very first meal. The men suffered from lead levels 4 times higher than normal. That poisoning explains the confusion, the poor decisions, the inability to hunt effectively in the final months. The Inuit people, who had lived in that frozen world for thousands of years, had always known parts of the story.
Their oral histories, passed down for generations, described white men with big ships who starved and died on the ice. Those stories were finally taken seriously in the late 20th century and helped guide the modern search teams to the exact locations of the wrecks. And so, as the Arctic night stretches on and the ice sighs in the wind, the lost Franklin expedition rests at last. 129 men who set out with hope and science and steam engines, who carried libraries and organs and dreams of glory, now lie forever in the place they tried so hard to conquer. Their story is not one of failure alone. It is a story of courage that refused to surrender even when the world turned white and silent and deadly cold. It is a story of love, Lady Jane's love that never gave up. It is a story of human endurance pushed to its farthest limit. Close your eyes now. Let the cold wind outside your window become the Arctic wind. Let the quiet of your room become the quiet inside those wooden halls where men once read by lamplight while the ice pressed against the sides. The ships are still there, sleeping beneath the waves. The men are at rest. And somewhere in the endless white, the Northwest Passage that they never quite sailed still waits, patient and eternal, for the next dreamer who will come.
Yet, even as the Erebus and the Terror settled into their long, quiet sleep on the seabed, the story of the 129 men did not fade into silence. Far across the cold Atlantic, in the quiet rooms of a modest London house, a small, determined woman named Lady Jane Franklin refused to let the Arctic keep its secret. She was already in her 60s when the ship sailed away, a widow once before, but this second loss burned in her like a steady flame that no amount of official doubt could extinguish. Every morning she would sit at her writing desk with maps spread before her pen moving slowly across paper as she wrote letter after letter to admirals, to politicians, to the President of the United States, even to the Emperor of Russia. She spent more than £35,000 of her own money, a fortune in those days, organizing private search expeditions when the government grew tired of looking. She became one of the most famous women in Victorian England, not because she sought fame, but because she simply would not give up on the husband who had once called her his own true love, and on the 128 other souls who had trusted him. Let us drift now through those long search years together, as gently as snow falling on an empty plain, while the names of forgotten captains and the dates on yellowed logbooks pass before us like slow-moving ice floes. The first organized searches began almost as soon as the ships were a year overdue. In 1850, the Admiralty sent out a whole fleet. There was Captain Horatio Austin with the sailing ships Resolute and Assistance, accompanied by the little steam tenders Pioneer and Intrepid. There was the veteran Arctic whaler Sir John Ross in the Felix, and Lady Jane's own ship, the Prince Albert, under the young commander Charles Forsyth. Even the Americans joined in, sending the Advance and the Rescue under Lieutenant Edwin de Haven, because the mystery had crossed oceans and touched hearts everywhere. These ships pushed into the same icy channels that Franklin had entered 5 years earlier. They fought gales and drifting pack ice. They wintered in places with names like Griffith Island and Melville Island, where the sun vanished for months and the cold made the wooden ships groan as if they were alive and suffering. On the little island of Beechey, almost by accident, they found the first real traces. 3 neat graves stood in a row on the stony beach, their wooden headboards still upright after 4 frozen winters. The inscriptions were perfectly clear in the thin Arctic light. sacred to the memory of John Torrington, A.B., of HMS Terror, who departed this life January 1st, 1846, aged 20 years. Beside him lay John Hartnell of the Erebus, died January 4th, and William Brain of the Erebus, died April 3rd. The graves were carefully dug, the bodies wrapped in sailcloth, the coffins made from ship's timbers. Small stones outlined each mound, as if someone had taken time to make them respectful. Inside the ship's winter quarters nearby, searchers found hundreds of empty meat tins, the remains of a forge, and a little observatory still standing, but no letter, no message, no sign of where the living had gone next. The men had died early, probably of tuberculosis, made worse by the first winter's damp and cold, and the rest had sailed on. Year after year the searches continued. Ships came and went. Some were crushed by ice and abandoned. Some returned with frostbitten crews and empty hands. The Admiralty grew weary. Parliament debated whether to spend more money on what many now called a hopeless cause. But Lady Jane never wavered. In 1852, she persuaded the government to send one last large expedition under Sir Edward Belcher, 5 ships in all. They explored farther west than anyone before, but still found nothing of Franklin's main party. Belcher, frustrated and running low on coal, actually ordered 4 of his own ships abandoned in the ice, an act that shocked the Navy. Only the Resolute drifted free the next summer and was later found by American whalers who sailed her home across the Atlantic as a gift to Queen Victoria.
Then, in 1854, a quiet Scottish doctor named John Ray brought back the first truly dark news. Ray was working for the Hudson's Bay Company, mapping the Arctic mainland on foot and by boat, living with Inuit hunters and learning their ways. Near the mouth of the Back River, which the Inuit called Great Fish River, he met a small group of Inuit families. Through sign language and a few words of Inuktitut he had learned, they told him a story that had been passed among their people for several winters. They spoke of white men seen several years earlier, dragging a heavy boat across the ice toward the river. The men were thin, starving, some already dead. Later, the Inuit had found many bodies on the shores and islands, some in tents, some lying where they had fallen, some with guns still in their hands. One woman remembered seeing 30 or 40 corpses inside a large tent, and signs that the last survivors had eaten the flesh of the dead. The Inuit had found silver spoons, forks, and watches engraved with the crests of British officers. They traded some of these relics to Ray. When Ray returned to England and reported what he had heard, the news exploded like a cannon shot. The newspapers printed the story in horrified headlines. Charles Dickens, the great novelist, wrote angry articles insisting that English gentlemen would never resort to cannibalism. It must be a mistake, or the Inuit must have been lying. The Admiralty tried to soften the report. But Lady Jane, reading the letters in private, accepted the truth with quiet dignity. She bought back as many of the silver relics as she could. Each spoon and fork carried the initials or family crests of men she had known: Crozier, Fitzjames, Gore. She kept them in a small velvet box on her mantelpiece and never spoke of them publicly. Still, she would not stop. In 1857, using the last of her money, she fitted out a small yacht called the Fox, commanded by Captain Francis Leopold McClintock, a tough, experienced Irish sailor who had served on earlier searches. The Fox was only 177 tons, tiny compared with the great ships of the original expedition, but she was strong and McClintock was careful. He sailed her into Baffin Bay, was trapped for an entire winter in the ice, and then, in the spring of 1859, he and his men began sledge journeys across the frozen sea.
On the northwest coast of King William Island, at a place they named Victory Point, McClintock's party found a tall stone cairn. Inside was a small tin cylinder containing the most important document ever recovered from the lost expedition. It was a printed form, the kind every ship carried for recording position, with a handwritten message around the margins. The first part, dated 28 May 1847, said the Erebus and Terror had wintered at Beechey Island and were now beset in the ice off King William Island. All was well. Sir John Franklin was in command. But below that, in a different hand, and dated 25 April 1848, came the terrible update. HM ships Terror and Erebus were deserted on the 22nd April 1848, having been beset since 12th September 1846. The officers and crews, consisting of 105 souls, under the command of Captain F.R.M. Crozier, landed here in lat. 69 degrees 37 minutes 42 seconds north, long 98 degrees 41 minutes west. Sir John Franklin died on the 11th June 1847, and the total loss by deaths in the expedition has been to this date 9 officers and 15 men. The note ended with Crozier's signature and the direction they planned to take, south toward the Back River. A few miles farther south, at a place now called Erebus Bay, McClintock found something even more haunting. A large ship's boat mounted on a heavy sledge lay on the gravel beach, pointing back toward the abandoned ships as if the men had changed their minds and tried to return. Inside the boat were 2 skeletons. One lay in the bow, wrapped in a double blanket and a greatcoat, with a silk handkerchief still tied neatly around the neck. The other was curled in the stern. Scattered around them were silk handkerchiefs, scented soap, a sponge, toothbrushes, a Bible, and a copy of The Vicar of Wakefield. There were also silver plate, books, curtain rods, and more than 20 pounds of chocolate, luxuries no starving man would have carried unless his mind was already wandering from scurvy and poison. The boat itself weighed so much that it would have taken at least a dozen strong men to pull it, yet only 2 had remained with it in the end. McClintock's men continued along the coast and found more scattered bones, more pieces of clothing, more relics. They talked with Inuit families who still remembered the white men. One old man showed them a place where many bodies had once lain. Another described how the last survivors had tried to fish through holes in the ice, but were too weak to succeed. The stories matched what Ray had heard years earlier.
When McClintock returned to England in 1859 with the Victory Point note and the relics, the nation finally accepted that the Franklin expedition was lost. Parliament voted a reward to the men of the Fox. Lady Jane was received by Queen Victoria and given a special medal. She lived on for another 20 years, always wearing a locket with her husband's portrait, always answering every letter about the expedition with the same quiet courtesy. She died in 1875 at the age of 83, still hoping that one day the ships themselves might be found. But the story was not over. In the 1860s and 1870s, other explorers continued to search the shores. In 1878-80, Lieutenant Frederick Schwatka of the United States Army led an overland expedition that traveled more than 3,000 miles by dog sledge. Schwatka's men found even more bones, including one skeleton still wearing a blue naval uniform with a gold watch in the pocket. They collected oral histories from the Inuit that added more detail, how some of the white men had camped near the mouth of the river, how others had tried to walk farther south, how the ice had never released the ships. Then, in the 1980s, modern science began to open the graves on Beechey Island. Dr. Owen Beatty, a Canadian anthropologist, exhumed the bodies of Torrington, Hartnell, and Brain. The men were almost perfectly preserved by the permafrost. Their skin was still pale, their hair neatly cut, their eyes closed as if sleeping.
Autopsies showed high levels of lead in their bones and hair, 4 times higher than normal. The lead had come from the solder used to seal the tin cans of preserved meat. Every meal had been slowly poisoning them, damaging their brains, weakening their bodies, making even simple decisions difficult. The same lead was found in the hair of the other crew members, whose remains were later discovered. In the 1990s and early 2000s, more bones were found along the southern coast of King William Island. Forensic experts noticed cut marks on some of the long bones, clean, deliberate cuts made by steel knives. The marks were in places where meat is removed from a body. The evidence, examined under microscopes and confirmed by multiple scientists, showed that in the final desperate weeks, some of the survivors had indeed turned to the bodies of their dead comrades. The Arctic had pushed 129 trained, disciplined British sailors to the outermost edge of human endurance. All the while, the ships themselves remained hidden. Year after year, Canadian search teams returned to the waters of Queen Maud Gulf and Terror Bay, dragging sonar and magnetometers behind their boats, scanning the muddy bottom in water so cold that divers could stay down only minutes at a time. The Canadian government, working with Parks Canada and Inuit communities, spent millions and many summers on the hunt. The Inuit oral histories, once dismissed by some, now guided the searchers. Elders spoke of the big ships that sank far to the south and described landmarks that matched modern charts. Then, on the 9th of September 2014, a sonar image appeared on a computer screen aboard the research ship Martin Bergman. There, in 11 meters of water, lay the unmistakable outline of a wooden ship, masts still standing, deck guns in place, hull almost perfectly intact. It was the Erebus. The wreck was so well preserved that the ship's bell could still be read. Erebus, 1826. 2 years later, in 2016, the Terror was found even farther south in Terror Bay, sitting upright on the bottom, her name clearly visible on the stern, her rudder still in place, as if she had been deliberately anchored before she sank. Today, protected as National Historic Sites, both wrecks are visited by remotely operated vehicles and occasionally by human divers in special cold water suits. Inside the Erebus, they have found plates still stacked in cupboards, bottles of wine with corks intact, the captain's desk with ink bottles, and even a pair of boots neatly placed beside a bunk. The Terror's great cabin still holds the little organ that once filled the ship with hymns on Sunday mornings. The artifacts are carefully brought up, conserved, and placed in museums in Nunavut and Ottawa, where school children and visitors can see with their own eyes the things that once belonged to men who vanished more than 175 years ago. And so the long, slow circle closes. The ships that sailed out of Greenhithe with flags flying and bands playing now rest again in cold water, this time forever. The men who marched south across the ice have left their bones and their stories scattered across the white landscape. Lady Jane's love, the searchers' courage, the Inuits' quiet knowledge, and the patient work of modern scientists have together lifted the veil that the Arctic held for so many decades. Nothing was hidden forever. Everything was remembered in the end. Let the quiet of your room settle around you now like fresh snow. Let the low hum of your hear or the distant sound of wind become the soft creak of wooden beams under pressure from ice that no longer moves. The expedition that began with hope and steam and libraries of books has become a single unbroken thread of human endurance woven into the fabric of the far north. The Northwest Passage that Franklin never sailed is now crossed every summer by icebreakers and cruise ships, yet the memory of those 129 men remains the truest map of that frozen world. Yet that memory was kept alive not only by British searchers and modern scientists, but by the people who had always called the Arctic home, the Inuit,
whose oral histories, passed down through generations around seal oil lamps in snow houses, preserved details that paper records could never capture. In the quiet evenings of the 1850s and 1860s, when the wind howled across the tundra and the aurora danced overhead like pale green curtains, families would tell their children about the strangers who came from the sea in 2 great wooden houses that could move without wind. They spoke of men with pale faces and heavy clothes who dragged boats across the ice, their steps slow and stumbling, their eyes hollow from hunger. One elder woman, speaking through an interpreter many years later, described how she had seen a group of perhaps 40 white men camped near the mouth of what we now call the Back River. Some were already lying still on the snow. Others sat staring into the fire, too weak to rise. She remembered the strange silver spoons they carried, bright against the white world, and how the last of them had tried to catch fish through holes in the ice, but could not hold the line steady. These stories were not told with fear or judgment. They were told the way the Inuit have always told stories of the land, with respect for those who tried and failed, with the quiet understanding that the Arctic gives life only to those who know its ways. The white men, the elders said, did not know how to hunt seals in the proper season, did not know how to build proper snow shelters, did not understand that caribou must be followed at the right time. So the ice took them, as it had taken others before and would take others after. But the Inuit remembered. They kept the relics they found, not as trophies, but as curious objects to trade or to use. A silver fork became a needle case. A gold watch became a child's toy. A naval sword was reshaped into a hunting knife. In this way, the last traces of the 129 men were gently woven into the daily life of the people who remained. It was one of these stories that reached Dr. John Ray in 1854, and it was these same stories that guided the American explorer Lieutenant Frederick Schwatka almost 30 years later. In 1878, Schwatka, a tall, quiet army officer from Illinois, set out from the Hudson's Bay Company post at Chesterfield Inlet with a small party that included an Inuit guide named Ebirbing and his wife Tukulito, both of whom had traveled with earlier explorers. Schwatka's plan was different from all the others. He would not come by ship. He would live entirely like the Inuit, traveling by dog sledge, sleeping in snow houses, eating whatever the land provided. For 2 full years, he and his men covered more than 3,000 miles across the frozen wilderness, the longest sledge journey ever made at that time. They moved slowly, day after day, the dogs pulling the low wooden sledges across the endless white, the runners hissing softly on the hard snow. At night they built their igloos, the blocks cut with long snow knives, the lamps burning seal oil that filled the small domes with warm yellow light and the smell of home. Schwatka's party followed the exact route the last survivors had taken. On the western shore of King William Island, they found the remains of the large boat that McClintock had discovered, now almost buried in gravel and snow. Inside, they recovered more artifacts, a pair of binoculars, more silver plate, a medicine chest still holding glass bottles with dried contents. A few miles farther, they came upon the skeleton of a man still wearing the remnants of a blue naval officer's uniform. Beside him lay a gold watch engraved with the name Lieutenant John Irving. The watch had stopped forever at 20 minutes past 8. Schwatka carefully buried the bones with full military honors, reading the Church of England service over the grave while the Arctic wind tugged at his coat.
The Inuit guides stood nearby, silent, understanding the ritual, even if the words were strange. Everywhere they went, Schwatka asked the same gentle questions through his interpreters. The elders spoke willingly now, because this white man lived as they did and showed respect. They told him of a large tent near the river mouth where many bodies had lain in rows. They spoke of another camp where the snow was stained dark and where knives had been used in ways no hunter would speak of lightly. One old man drew a map in the snow with his finger, showing exactly where the two ships had been abandoned and how they had later drifted south with the ice. Schwatka wrote everything down in his notebook by the light of the seal oil lamp, his fingers stiff with cold, his breath forming small clouds that rose and froze against the igloo walls. When he returned to the United States in 1880, he brought back crates of relics and pages of notes that added more quiet pieces to the puzzle. The world read his report with a mixture of awe and sorrow. The Franklin mystery was no longer just a naval tragedy. It had become a human story, written in frost and bone and memory. The decades rolled on like slow-moving ice. The 19th century gave way to the 20th. Airplanes flew over the Arctic for the first time. Radio reached the remote trading posts, yet still the exact fate of the ships remained hidden beneath the water and the ice. Then, in the summer of 1981, a Canadian anthropologist named Dr. Owen Beatty stepped onto the stony beach of Beechey Island with a small team of scientists. The 3 graves they had read about in old books were still there, the headboards weathered, but standing after more than 135 years. With the permission of the Canadian government and in the presence of Inuit observers, Beatty and his colleagues carefully opened the grave of Petty Officer John Torrington, the first man to die on the expedition. The permafrost had kept the body almost perfectly preserved. When the lid of the wooden coffin was lifted, Torrington lay there as if he had only just fallen asleep, his hands folded, his eyes closed, his dark hair neatly parted, his face pale but calm. He wore the same woolen shirt and trousers he had been buried in on the 1st of January, 1846. A small tuft of cotton was still pressed against his nostrils to stop any bleeding in his final moments. Over the next few summers, Beatty's team exhumed the other 2 men as well, John Hartnell and William Brain. Each time the scene was the same, bodies perfectly preserved, clothing intact, expressions peaceful. Samples of hair, bone, and tissue were taken for laboratory study. The results were startling. The men's bodies contained lead levels 4 times higher than normal for the Victorian era. The source was clear. The solder used to seal the thousands of tin cans of preserved meat and vegetables. Every spoonful the sailors had eaten during their long voyage had been slowly poisoning them. The lead had damaged their brains, weakened their immune systems, and made the early signs of scurvy far worse. Beatty's book, Frozen in Time, published in 1987, included photographs that the world had never expected to see. The faces of men who had sailed away in 1845, now looking back across more than a century of silence. The images were shown on television and in newspapers, and for the first time the public could look directly into the eyes of the lost expedition. In the 1990s and early 2000s, other researchers walked the same shores. They found scattered bones along the southern coast of King William Island and on the small islands nearby. Some of the long bones showed cut marks, straight, deliberate incisions made by steel knives while the bone was still fresh. Forensic experts from several countries examined the marks under microscopes and agreed that they could only have been made during the final desperate weeks when some of the survivors, driven beyond endurance by starvation and lead poisoning, had turned to the bodies of their dead companions. The evidence was published in scientific journals with careful, respectful language. No one sensationalized it.
Everyone understood that this was not a story of horror, but of the outermost limit of human survival in a place that allows no mistakes. All the while, the search for the ships continued. Each summer, teams from Parks Canada and the government of Nunavut returned to the waters of Queen Maud Gulf. They used side-scan sonar towed behind small boats, magnetometers that could detect iron from many miles away, and divers in thick dry suits who could work only a few minutes at a time in water just above freezing. The work was slow, methodical, and often discouraging. Year after year, they mapped the seabed, cataloged every rock and wreck, and returned home with empty hands. Inuit elders were consulted at every stage. Their knowledge of currents, of how the ice moves, of places where big wooden things had been seen in the past, helped narrow the search boxes on the charts. Then, on the afternoon of September 9, 2014, aboard the research vessel Martin Bergman, a sonar technician named Ryan Harris stared at a screen and felt his heart stop. In 11 meters of water, perfectly outlined in the murky image, lay the unmistakable shape of a sailing ship, masts still standing, deck structures intact, 2 long guns still mounted on the bow. The Erebus had been found. The announcement was made quietly at first, then with growing excitement that spread around the world. 2 years later, in 2016, the same team discovered the Terror even farther south, sitting upright in the shallow waters of a small bay that now bears her name. Her stern was so clear that the carved letters spelling Terror could be read from the surface. Both ships were declared National Historic Sites and placed under the protection of the Inuit people whose ancestors had first seen them. Today, remotely operated vehicles glide silently through the cold, dark water inside the wrecks. Their lights reveal sights that no one has seen since 1848. On the Erebus, rows of dinner plates still sit neatly stacked in the officer's pantry. Bottles of wine lie on their sides in the hold, corks intact. In Captain Fitzjames's cabin, a writing desk stands exactly where it was left, ink bottles and pens still in place. The Terror's great cabin, where the little organ once played hymns, is almost untouched, the wooden panels still polished by the cold sea. Divers in special suits have entered both ships on rare occasions, moving slowly, their bubbles rising like silver prayers through the still water. They touch nothing, they only look, document, and leave the ships as quiet shrines to the men who once lived inside them. The artifacts that have been carefully raised, a brass button, a clay pipe, a child's leather boot that belonged to no one on the expedition but was perhaps a good luck charm, are now displayed in the Nautilik Heritage Center in Jawahaven and in Ottawa. School children from Nunavut visit and learn how their ancestors helped solve a mystery that once belonged only to the outside world. The Northwest Passage that Franklin sought is now navigated every summer by icebreakers and tourist ships, yet the memory of those 129 men remains the truest map of that frozen world. Yet that memory was kept alive not only by the steady passage of modern icebreakers and tourist ships that now glide through the very waters Franklin sought, but by the quiet, determined voice of one woman whose letters crossed oceans and decades like slow-moving carriers of hope. In the dim lamplight of her London drawing room, Lady Jane Franklin sat night after night at her writing desk, the paper edged in black as if already mourning, her small, neat handwriting flowing across page after page. She wrote to the President of the United States, to the Emperor of Russia, to the Lords of the Admiralty, to anyone who might send another ship north. One November evening in 1849, she addressed the President of the Royal Society with urgent words that still echo with quiet desperation. It is the urgency of the case which must be my excuse for thus presuming to trouble you. since in order to send any effectual assistance, it is necessary to act decisively and at once, delay being fatal to the object. She signed every letter with the same steady hand, never allowing her handwriting to tremble even when her heart did. She spent more than £35,000 of her own money, selling jewelry, borrowing from friends, refusing to accept that the Arctic had simply swallowed her husband and his 128 companions without a trace. Her letters became a lifeline, not just for her own grief, but for the entire nation's conscience, and they kept the search alive long after the government had grown weary. Let us drift back now, gently, into the wooden world the men once inhabited before the ice closed its fist forever, back to the days when the Erebus and the Terror still felt like home. Inside the ships during those first 2 winters, the routine was almost soothing in its orderliness, a small civilization afloat in white emptiness. Each morning the men rose to the sound of the ship's bell, marking 8 bells. The stoves were lit, and warm air from the central heating system whispered through vents into the lower decks. Breakfast was porridge or preserved meat from the tin cans, eaten at long tables in the mess. Franklin had forbidden swearing and drunkenness, so the talk was quiet, often about the scientific work that filled their days. Officers and men alike took magnetic readings, measured temperatures, recorded the slow drift of the ice. The ships carried more than 1,000 books, novels by Dickens and Scott, volumes of natural history, even back issues of Punch for laughter on quiet evenings. In the great cabin of the Erebus, a small organ stood ready, and on Sunday mornings the men gathered to sing hymns, their voices rising together while frost patterned the portholes like delicate lace. The officers played chess or read aloud from the library. The sailors mended sails, carved small models from scraps of wood, or tended the few sheep and pigs that had survived the voyage north until the cold claimed them. Even the little monkey Jacko, brought aboard for amusement, had his own small coat and cap, and was passed from hand to hand like a living talisman. The food, however, carried a hidden shadow. The tin cans, hurriedly supplied by a contractor named Goldner just weeks before sailing, had been sealed with lead solder that leached slowly into every meal. No one knew it then. The men ate their salted pork, their vegetables, their chocolate, and felt only the steady strength the provisions gave them. Yet month by month the lead built up in their bodies, clouding thoughts, loosening teeth, making even simple tasks tiring. Outside the hull, the ice pressed with a low, constant groan, sometimes cracking like distant thunder, sometimes squeezing so tightly that the timbers creaked in protest. The temperature on deck could fall to 48 degrees below zero at night, so cold that a man removing his balaclava might leave skin and beard behind on the wool. Yet inside, under the glow of oil lamps and the warmth of the stoves, the ships remained islands of Victorian order, decks swept, brass polished, flags stowed neatly. Christmas of 1846 was celebrated with extra rations, carols on the organ, and a small theatrical performance in the mess. The men laughed, toasted the Queen, and told themselves that next summer the ice would surely release them, and the Northwest Passage would open like a door. But the ice did not open, and when Franklin died on the 11th of June, 1847, the quiet command passed to Captain Francis Crozier, who knew in his bones that the supplies would not last another full winter. His log entries grew shorter, more careful. The men continued their duties, but the shadow lengthened. By the spring of 1848, the coal was nearly gone, the preserved meat had become a slow poison, and scurvy had begun its cruel work on gums and joints. On the 22nd of April, 1848, Crozier gave the order everyone had dreaded. The 105 survivors abandoned the ships, dragging heavy boats on sledges across the jagged ice toward the distant Back River. They left behind the libraries they had read cover to cover, the organ that had filled the cabins with music, the mahogany tables where officers had once dined. They took what they could carry: tents, blankets, guns, a little chocolate, silver plate that somehow seemed important even then. The trail they left was one of quiet abandonment, a writing desk here, a stack of books there, a pair of boots standing upright in the snow as if their owner had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. Years later, when searchers followed that same trail, they found these relics exactly as the men had left them, preserved by the cold like messages in bottles. And still, Lady Jane's letters kept coming, each one a small act of faith. She wrote even when newspapers suggested the men were long dead. She wrote when officials gently suggested she accept the inevitable. She wrote until her own health failed, until her eyes grew dim, until the very paper in her hand felt like the last thread connecting her to the white North. When McClintock returned in 1859 with the Victory Point note and the silver relics, she met him in private, touched the engraved spoons, and thanked him with the same calm dignity she had shown the world for 14 years. She never remarried. She wore a locket with Franklin's miniature portrait until the day she died in 1875, and she was buried with full honors beside her husband's empty grave in Westminster Abbey.
The story did not end with her passing. In the 20th century, the Arctic slowly began to give up more of its secrets. In 1981, Dr. Owen Beatty and his team opened the graves on Beechey Island under the pale midnight sun. The bodies of Torrington, Hartnell, and Brain lay as if sleeping, their faces peaceful, their clothing still buttoned. Laboratory tests later revealed the lead levels that had poisoned them all. In the 1990s and 2000s, more bones were found along the southern shores, some bearing the clear marks of steel knives used in the final weeks when hunger and confusion had pushed men past every boundary they had once known. The evidence was handled with the deepest respect, published in scientific papers without judgment, simply as the record of what the ice can do to even the strongest among us. Then came the summer of 2014, and the long search for the ships themselves reached its quiet climax. For weeks, the Parks Canada team, working in partnership with Inuit communities from Joa Haven, had been towing side-scan sonar behind their small research vessel in the waters of Queen Maud Gulf. Each day began at 7 in the morning and ended at 8 in the evening, the crew scanning the muddy seabed mile after mile. On the 1st of September, they investigated a promising lead on land, an old Inuit tent ring on a small island. The next morning, September 2nd, senior archaeologist Ryan Harris sat before the sonar screen aboard the Martin Bergman. Suddenly, a clear, unmistakable shape appeared, the outline of a sailing ship, mast still standing, guns on deck, lying upright in only 11 meters of water. The room fell silent. Harris later said the image was so perfect it looked like a photograph. They had found the Erebus. 2 years later, in 2016, the same team located the Terror farther south in a bay now named after her, sitting perfectly upright, her name still legible on the stern, as if she had waited patiently for them all along. Today, remotely operated vehicles glide through the cold, dark interiors like gentle ghosts. Their lights reveal dinner plates stacked in cupboards, wine bottles lying on their sides, the captain's desk with pens still in place. In 2019, divers carefully raised more than 350 artifacts, a brass button, a clay pipe, a child's boot that no one on the expedition owned, but that someone had carried anyway, perhaps as a reminder of home. And in recent years, modern science has begun to name the dead. In 2021, DNA from a tooth and bone recovered in 2013 identified Warrant Officer John Gregory, the engineer aboard the Erebus. In 2024, a jawbone found in 1993 on King William Island, part of a scattered heap of 400 bones belonging to at least 13 men, was matched through Y chromosome analysis to a living descendant. The remains belong to Captain James Fitzjames of the Erebus, one of the senior officers who led the final march. The same bones showed clear evidence that, in the end, he too had been among those whose bodies sustained the last survivors. The identification was announced with quiet dignity, closing another small circle after 179 years. And so the Arctic, which once seemed only a place of silence and loss, has become a place of remembrance. The Northwest Passage that Franklin never sailed is now a route of summer traffic, yet every ship that passes those waters carries with it the invisible company of 129 men who tried first. Their story is no longer one of mystery alone. It is a story of ordinary sailors singing hymns while the ice pressed against the hull, of a wife writing letters by lamplight for 14 years, of scientists and Inuit elders working together under the midnight sun, of DNA threads reaching across centuries to give names back to boons. It is a story that asks us gently what we would carry in our pockets if we had to walk across the ice tomorrow, and what we would leave behind when the cold finally asked for everything. Close your eyes now and let the quiet surround you. Let the low hum of your room become the soft creak of wooden beams resting on the seabed. Let the darkness behind your eyelids become the darkness inside those halls, where plates still wait in cupboards, and the bell that once marked the hours still hangs silent. The men are at rest. The ships are at rest. The ice that once held them has released them at last into memory, where they sail on forever in the calm, endless narrative of human courage and the patient, whispering north.
And in that patient, whispering north, the men's final journey unfolded one slow footstep at a time across a landscape that seemed to stretch forever in every direction, white upon white, where the only sound was the soft crunch of boots on snow and the occasional low groan of ice shifting beneath the sledges. On the 22nd of April, 1848, when Captain Crozier gave the order to leave the ships, the 105 survivors stepped out onto the frozen surface of the sea ice off the northwest coast of King William Island. The sun had returned, but brought little warmth. It hung low and pale, casting long blue shadows across the pressure ridges that rose like frozen waves. Each sledge carried a boat inverted over it, the whole contraption weighing well over a ton. The men harnessed themselves with ropes like draft horses, leaning forward into the traces, their breath rising in steady white plumes that froze instantly on their beards and eyelashes. They moved perhaps 2 miles on the first day, then made camp, pitching tents on the ice and lighting small stoves that gave more smoke than heat. Someone read a few verses from the Bible, while the others listened in silence, the pages crackling in the cold. No one complained aloud. Discipline still held, the old naval order lingering like a faint echo inside exhausted bodies already carrying the weight of lead and scurvy. Day after day, the column crept southward. They crossed from the sea ice onto the rocky shore of King William Island, following the coastline where the land met the frozen water in a jagged line. Here and there they left small caches of supplies, hoping against hope that a rescue party might follow and find them useful. A pair of boots stood upright in the snow, as if their owner had simply stepped out of them for a moment. A mahogany writing desk, too heavy to carry farther, was set down carefully with its drawers still closed. Books were abandoned in neat stacks, their spines facing the wind as though waiting for someone to open them again. The men grew quieter. Their faces, once ruddy from shipboard life, had turned gray and hollow. Gums bled when they tried to eat the last of the chocolate. Joints swelled so badly that some could no longer bend their knees properly and had to be helped along by comrades who were themselves barely able to stand. Yet still they pulled. Still they sang a few lines of a hymn when the sun dipped low and the temperature dropped again toward 40 below. The Arctic did not rage, it simply waited, patient and immense, letting the cold and the hunger do their work without hurry. At a place later named Erebus Bay, the column split for a time. Some men continued south, while a smaller party remained with one of the boats. When searchers found that boat years afterward, it was still pointing back toward the abandoned ships, as though its occupants had changed their minds and tried to return. Inside lay two skeletons. One rested in the bow, wrapped in a double blanket and a greatcoat with a silk handkerchief tied neatly around the neck. The other was curled in the stern. Around them lay toothbrushes, combs, scented soap, slippers, a sponge, several books, including a copy of The Vicar of Wakefield, and more than 20 pounds of chocolate still wrapped in its original paper. Curtain rods and silver plate had been packed as well, odd treasures that spoke of minds already wandering in the grip of lead poisoning and starvation. The boat itself was so heavy that it would have required at least a dozen strong men to move it across the ice. Only these two had stayed with it until the end, their final camp a small circle of quiet dignity amid the endless white. Farther south, near the mouth of the Back River, the last camps formed at what the Inuit would later call Starvation Cove. Here, the survivors tried to fish through holes chopped in the sea ice, but their hands shook too badly to hold the lines steady. They set up tents and lay down inside them, some never rising again. The snow drifted over the canvas until the tents looked like gentle white mounds. When Inuit families passed through the area in the following seasons, they found the bodies lying where they had fallen, some still clutching guns, others with silver spoons clutched in frozen fingers. One elder woman remembered seeing 30 or 40 men inside a single large tent, all still and silent. She spoke of the strange marks on some of the bones, clean cuts made by steel knives while the flesh was still fresh. The stories were told without horror, simply as part of the land's long memory, the way one might speak of a hard winter when the seals did not come. The Inuit took what they needed from the site, a knife, a spoon reshaped into a needle case, a length of rope, and left the rest to the wind and snow. In this way, the final traces of the 129 men were gently folded into the daily life of the people who had always known how to live where others could not. Those oral histories waited patiently for decades until outsiders learned to listen. In the 1870s, Lieutenant Frederick Schwatka's long sledge journey brought him to the same shores, and the elders spoke freely because he lived as they did, sleeping in snow houses and eating seal meat. They drew maps in the snow with their fingers and described the exact places where the white men had camped and where the ships had first been abandoned. Schwatka listened, wrote everything down by the light of a seal oil lamp, and later buried the bones he found with full military honors, reading the service while the wind tugged at his coat. His notes added another layer of quiet detail to the record, showing that the men had tried until the very last to maintain order and hope. The years passed like slow seasons of ice. Lady Jane Franklin continued writing her letters until her eyes grew too dim to see the page clearly. She kept a small velvet box on her mantelpiece containing the silver relics McClintock had brought back, each spoon and fork engraved with the crests of officers she had known by name. She never remarried. She wore a locket with her husband's portrait until 1875, when she was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey beside an empty grave that bore Sir John Franklin's name. Her persistence had kept the search alive long enough for the truth to surface, and her quiet dignity became part of the story itself, a thread of love woven through the cold.
In the 20th century, the Arctic began to open its secrets more willingly to science. The graves on Beechey Island were opened with great care in the 1980s, revealing bodies so perfectly preserved that their hair still held the shape of the combs that had last touched it. Laboratory tests showed lead levels 4 times higher than normal, the silent poison from every meal sealed inside those hurried tin cans. Later, bones collected along the southern coast showed the same clear knife marks that the Inuit had described, examined under microscopes by anthropologists who spoke of them only in the measured language of evidence, never judgment. The story was no longer hidden, it was simply told plainly, as the land itself tells its stories. Then, on a bright September afternoon in 2014, the long underwater search reached its gentle conclusion. Aboard the research vessel Martin Bergman, the sonar screen suddenly showed a perfect ship shape resting in 11 meters of water. The Erebus had been found, her masts still standing, her deck guns in place, her hull almost untouched by time. 2 years later, the Terror appeared farther south, upright and serene in the bay that now bears her name. In 2015, divers working in the freezing water carefully raised the Erebus bell, its bronze surface still bright after more than a century and a half beneath the sea. When it was gently lifted into the sunlight, the inscription Erebus 1826 could be read clearly, and for a moment everyone on deck stood in silence, listening as if the bell might ring once more on its own. The sound of that moment was not loud. It was the soft intake of breath from people who understood they were touching something that had last been touched by men who never came home. Today, those same wrecks are visited by remotely operated vehicles whose lights glide through the dark cabins like quiet companions. Plates remain stacked in cupboards. Wine bottles lie on their sides with corks still firm. In one cabin, a pair of boots stands neatly beside a bunk as though the owner had just stepped away. Artifacts carefully brought to the surface now rest in museums in Joahaven and Ottawa, where children from Nunavut touch the same silver spoons their ancestors once found on the shore. In 2021, DNA from a single tooth identified Warrant Officer John Gregory, the engineer who had kept the ship's engines running until the ice won. In 2024, a jawbone recovered decades earlier was matched through advanced genetic analysis to Captain James Fitzjames, whose remains had lain among the scattered bones at one of the final camps. The identification closed another small circle, giving a name back to a man who had once commanded with calm authority and who, in the end, had given everything so that a few others might have one more chance. And so the story settles now into the same calm it began with, a single unbroken thread of human courage stretching from the cheering crowds at Greenhithe in 1845 to the quiet museums of the 21st century. The Northwest Passage that Franklin sought is crossed every summer by modern ships,
Yet every vessel that passes those waters moves through an invisible company of 129 men who tried first. Their libraries are gone, their organs silent, their steam engines cold forever, but their endurance remains, woven into the fabric of the North like frost on a window pane. The ice no longer holds them, the sea has released them into memory. And somewhere in the endless white, where the aurora still dances on winter nights and the wind whispers across the snow, the patient North keeps its quiet watch, remembering every footstep, every hymn, every letter written by lamplight, every gentle act of remembrance that followed. Let the quiet of your room wrap around you now like fresh snow settling on an empty plain. Let the low sound of your breathing become the soft creak of wooden beams resting on the seabed. Let the darkness behind your eyelids become the darkness inside those halls where plates still wait in perfect rows and the bell that once marked the hours hangs silent at last. The men are at rest. The ships are at rest. The story sails on forever in the calm, endless narrative of the whispering North, carrying you gently toward sleep.
Yet the voices of the Inuit families who still walk those same shores today continue to carry the story forward in their own gentle way, passing it from grandmother to grandchild around the soft yellow light of seal oil lamps inside snow houses that rise like gentle white domes against the endless winter sky. These are not tales of tragedy alone, but of respect for the land and for the men who tried to meet it without knowing its ways. An elder in the community of Joahaven, speaking in the 1970s to a researcher who had learned to listen without interrupting, described how his great-grandfather had come upon a camp where several white men sat staring into a small fire that gave no warmth. They had silver objects in their pockets that shone in the sun, and one of them tried to speak, but the words would not come. The great-grandfather left them a piece of caribou meat and showed them how to cut it thin, but the men's hands shook too much. The story was told without sadness, only with the quiet understanding that the Arctic decides who stays and who returns to the sea. Another family memory, shared by a woman whose grandmother had been a child at the time, spoke of finding a small boat half buried in the snow with two men inside, one still holding a book open on his chest as if reading until the very end. These stories were finally written down in the late 20th century when Inuit elders decided the outside world was ready to hear them with respect, and they helped guide the modern search teams to the exact bays where the ships eventually sank. On the morning of September 9, 2014, the research vessel Martin Bergman rocked gently on the calm waters of Queen Maud Gulf under a pale Arctic sun. The crew had been scanning the seabed for weeks, towing the side-scan sonar behind the boat in long, patient lines, checking every promising shadow on the screen. Ryan Harris, the senior marine archaeologist, sat in the small control room with a cup of coffee growing cold beside him. The screen showed the usual muddy bottom, rocks, and occasional debris. Then, at 11:47 a.m., a clear, unmistakable shape appeared. The straight lines of a ship's hull, the raised deck, the masts still standing upright after 166 years underwater. The room fell completely silent for a long moment. Harris leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's a ship." The captain was called, the team gathered, and for the next hour they circled the site slowly, confirming with multiple passes that it was indeed the Erebus, lying in only 11 meters of water, almost perfectly preserved by the cold, dark conditions.
When the news was radioed to the shore station in Cambridge Bay, the Inuit leaders who had partnered in the search stood quietly on the dock, nodding as if they had always known the ships would be found when the time was right. 2 years later, in 2016, the same team discovered the Terror in a small bay farther south, sitting upright on the bottom, with her name still readable on the stern, as though she had anchored herself there on purpose and waited patiently for someone to come.
In 2019, under strict protocols to protect the sites as National Historic Sites, divers in thick dry suits and special heating systems descended for the first time. Their lights cut through the dark water like slow-moving stars, revealing sights no one had seen since 1848. On the Erebus, the pantry cupboards were still closed, and when one was gently opened, the plates were stacked exactly as the steward had left them. In the great cabin, a writing desk stood with pens and ink bottles in place. On the Terror, the little organ that had once filled the ship with Sunday hymns was still there, the keys covered in a thin layer of silt, but the wood as smooth as the day it was installed. Artifacts were raised with infinite care, a brass button with the Royal Navy anchor, a clay pipe with tooth marks still visible on the stem, a small leather boot that no crew member had owned, but that someone had carried as a reminder of home or a child left behind. Each item was conserved in Ottawa and then returned to Nunavut, where they are displayed in the Nautilik Heritage Center so that local children can touch the history of their own land. Modern science has continued to illuminate the quiet details that the ice had hidden. Studies on the lead levels in the bones and hair showed not only poisoning, but how it affected the men's minds in the final months. Confusion, poor judgment, inability to plan simple hunting trips that might have saved them. The tin cans, supplied in such haste, had been the hidden enemy from the first meal. Recent research using advanced imaging has even shown the exact paths the lead took through the body, weakening muscles and clouding thoughts until the simplest decision became impossible. Yet the men kept their discipline until the very end, pulling the heavy sledges, singing hymns, reading from the Bible, maintaining the order they had been taught even when the world around them had become nothing but white and cold. In recent years, Inuit elders have walked the shores with archaeologists, pointing to places where their grandparents had found relics, sharing stories that had never been written down before. One elder in 2023 stood on the beach at Starvation Cove and described how, as a child, he had been shown the exact spot where the last tent had stood, the snow stained dark in places, and how his people had covered the remains with stones out of respect. These collaborations have made the search not just a scientific project, but a shared journey of remembrance, bridging two worlds that once seemed far apart, but are now joined by the same frozen landscape. And so, as the long Arctic nights stretch on, and the aurora dances overhead in pale green and violet curtains, the story of the lost Franklin expedition rests at last in peace. The 129 men who set out with hope and steam and libraries of books have become part of the land they tried to conquer. Their ships sleep beneath the waves. Their bones are scattered across the white. Their names are spoken again in museums and around campfires. Lady Jane's letters, the searchers' sledges, the scientists' sonar, the elders' memories, all have woven together into one continuous thread of human endurance. The Northwest Passage they sought is now a summer highway for ships, yet every vessel that passes feels the presence of those who came first, a quiet company sailing alongside in the calm, endless narrative of the North. Let the quiet of your room become the quiet of that vast white world. Let the soft sound of your breathing match the slow rhythm of the ice sighing in the wind. Let the darkness behind your closed eyes become the darkness inside the wooden hulls, where everything still waits, perfectly preserved, for no one but memory to visit. The men have finished their march.
The ships have finished their voyage. The story has found its gentle ending, carrying you now, slowly and peacefully, into the deep, restful sleep that the Arctic itself seems to whisper is waiting just beyond the next snowdrift, where all is calm and all is well.